Welcome to Herbally Yours, an adventure into the world of natural medicine. Here is your host, Dr. Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse who will help you take the leap to ultimate wellness.
Greetings, and thank you for joining me, Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse, for another edition of Herbally Yours, right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. Herbally Yours brings you the latest information about the many facets in the world of natural living. Today, my guest is Sally Norton, and she is a consultant, writer, educator, and speaker with over 30 years of experience in health promotion and the wellness field. She specializes in helping people improve their health with an oxalate-avoiding diet, which many of you will be very surprised to hear this information. Sally holds a nutrition degree from my own alma mater, Cornell University, and a master's of public health as well. She worked in the field of medical education at UNC Medical School's program on integrative medicine and as a research grant writer and research administrator at the Virginia Commonwealth University School of Medicine. So thank you so much for joining us today, Sally.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Now, your information that we're going to share today, I think will surprise a lot of people because, you know, the big buzzword is go green and go plant-based. And your information is going to bump up against that, but is science-based.
It sure is. It is a shocker, which is why I ended up starting to do this full time.
Now, let's talk about your history. What made you get into health and nutrition in the first place?
I was interested since I was in kindergarten. They would tell us like how many glasses of milk we need. And I would run home and tell mommy, we're supposed to have this and this. I had this goody two shoes MO. And I had also had a series of issues as a little girl that were like strep throat and things like that. I was banned from the swimming pool and ended up getting my tonsils taken out when I was 5. So I think very early on, I got clued into the fact that if you don't feel good, your life is terrible and you should do everything you can so you feel as best you can. So I've been into it a long time. And it was the 7th grade when I heard a film strip from the science teacher that convinced me that if we knew what to eat, we could avoid diseases like heart disease and cancer. And why not learn that and teach that and help people have great, productive lives? So this health promotion thing has been my thing forever.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you said your tonsils were taken out. Mine were too. I just think it was the in thing years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, if you got a couple of sore throats, instead of using echinacea and golden seal and garlic and hot water and lemon, like I did for my children who never had an antibiotic, not once, and they are 47 and 42, then the thing to do was just go ahead and take your tonsils out. It was like a very in thing.
Well, when I was a little kid in the late 1960s, you know, we were in the space age of Tang and all of that, and people trusted modern medicine and science and had dropped these more classic things.
That's so true. And it's such a shame. They just went straight to antibiotics, which I'm sure you were given.
And a spoon, this pink gunk that tastes terrible. That's enough to teach you want to be a good kid because that stuff tasted awful.
You're so right. So then you were interested in nutrition even back then, and then you went ahead and made it your focus in your education.
I sure did. I was lucky enough to live up the street from Cornell and decided by high school that would be the place to get a decent nutrition degree.
Oh, you actually lived in Ithaca?
I did. Well, no, I'm from Syracuse,
town.
which is just an hour and a half up the street, up Route 81. So it was kind of, the right thing to do. It's a very reputed school. Obviously, it's an Ivy League school. It's one of the top ones in nutrition. And so it was a convenient luxury to be able to go to Cornell.
So you did that, and then you followed what you felt besides your focus in health and nutrition. Professionally, you also did that for yourself personally, and you did what you thought through your studies of what you would call a healthy lifestyle.
But I was influenced by Frances LePay's book, Diet for a Small Planet.
I knew her too.
Right after I got
she's still around.
High school, I started going vegetarian. I loved to cook all through college. I did all my own home cooking. And later on, I was influenced by John Robbins and went vegan. I had a total of 8 years of each type of vegetarianism, straight vegetarian with a little yogurt and eggs thrown in, and then veganism. And so I had 16 years of that. And during that time, I had a terrible time with arthritis. I had to leave Cornell for foot surgery. I didn't recover well from my foot surgery. I was on crutches, painkillers, and even wheelchairs through my 20s. And it turns out, I learned later on when I changed my diet and got rid of the high-oxalate foods, that all that struggle with pain, arthritis, and foot problems was related to the natural compounds in my healthy organic foods. That was
so wait,
shocker.
let me stop you there for a minute. That is a shocker because you made every effort to do what a lot of people are just jumping on the bandwagon and doing, because plant-based is like a rage right now. They're making plant-based hamburgers that look like hamburgers. If you read what's in those, I have that posted on my website at naturalnurse.com, fake meat. It is loaded with all kinds of terrible problems, but you're talking about even just things like spinach and kale, because people sometimes switch so severely over that they believe that all green all the time is good. And so they're juicing green in the morning, and then they're steaming green, and then they're having a salad. And that's what
we're told this. We're hearing that message, more green vegetables, more plant foods from every segment of the messaging, whether it's mainstream public health and nutrition or holistic healing or just internet gurus. Everyone says plants are the answer.
Right. So now you used a word that I bet most of our listeners have no idea what that word even means. What is oxalate?
Oxalate. Yeah, no one's heard of this thing. It's this missing thing, which is surprising because it was a centerpiece of early chemistry in the 1700s. And it was used in factories and in home cleaning for bleaching. The whole textile industry, the leather industry, they use oxalic acid to bleach things in the 1700s. In the home environment, you could go to the druggist and bring home some oxalic acid crystals, which looks like Epsom salts, and use it to clean anything in the household. And people started accidentally ingesting it because there was poor labeling back then and poor literacy. And since it looked like Epsom salts, you could even ingest a whole tablespoon to fix a tummy problem by mistake and then be dead in 2 hours. So the very earliest experimental, really interesting study published in 1823 featured oxalic acid poisoning because it had become a big public health problem in England.
So, but you're saying oxalic acid in that way is kind of like an isolate, and it looks like little crystals.
Exactly.
Which is interesting.
Plants make the oxalic acid as well so that you don't see it in the plant, but it's there helping give tart flavors and doing things that plants need. And so certain plants, even though we've domesticated a lot of plants and made them edible, certain plants that we still consider edible are quite high in oxalic acid, which is also called oxalate.
So that's really interesting. What gave you a clue that it might be this excellent, super green, raw food, vegan diet that really was your problem?
Oh, I wish I was smart enough to have figured that out decades ago. I mean, why wasn't I matching up my poor health performance with my wonderful diet and saying, the wonderful diet isn't working? I was so convinced my great diet worked. It took me a very long time, and it took an attack of genital pain to cause my husband to get on Google in 2009 and find the Vulva Pain Foundation, which has been teaching a low oxalate diet to address pelvic pain syndromes for 26 years now. I didn't know anything about that, and it didn't make any sense to me, but I was desperate. So I ordered their materials and started learning a little bit about this pelvic pain thing. But she didn't explain it was my arthritis, my back pain, and my sleep disorder. By now, I'm in my late 40s, and I'm struggling and needing a hysterectomy. I'm bleeding heavily. I've got back problems, and my sleep isn't good, and I have a lot of fatigue. And all of this in the context of a very healthy lifestyle. I am an expert in holistic living and how to eat well and grow organic food, and I am not well. So it took me a while to even realize what was going on in my own body. It wasn't until several years after that, in 2013, when I really had the insight, when I added back some celery and kiwi, these are two of the high oxalate foods. I was doing them every day to try to fix constipation, to try to fix my sleep disorder. I was a mess. And that brought back the old arthritis that I had so severely in my 20s during my vegan years. And that clued me in that, I need to pay attention to oxalate, not just for pelvic pain or genital pain, but for arthritis. And I was thinking, well, that's crazy. I mean, I've had all this arthritic pain and it's been my healthy food. So I needed to knuckle down and get more serious and learn more about the foods. And so I got a little stricter and started doing the low oxalate diet correctly. And lo and behold, my sleep disorder started lifting. I had to quit my career by now because I wasn't functioning. I had become completely disabled. I was to the point where I couldn't even hardly read the mail anymore, let alone hold a job and write research grants.
Well, let me remind our listeners that you are listening to Herbally Yours on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse. And today my guest is Sally Norton, and she holds a master's in nutrition degree from Cornell University. And she's talking about something that you might not know about, which is called oxalate, which is very high in dark green leafy vegetables, what you're all trying to eat more of, which, by the way, is a good idea because everything in balance. But you can find Sally at sallyknorton.com. We will have a link to her information as well. And I know that you have an article in Bottom Line magazine, Bottom Line Health, which people can read. And you also have done some videos specifically about this, and you have a Vimeo link that people can watch. I watched that. That was very like a cartoon, kind of, right? About the vegetables. It was really cute. So what are some of the vegetables that are high in this oxalate?
Well, in the leafy green department, there's really just 3 or 4 to be concerned about. And that is spinach, beet greens, and Swiss chard. Swiss chard is beet greens without the beet. Basically, it's the same plant. They're both even worse than spinach. And then there's sorrel, which hardly anyone in the U.S. eats, but it is an old traditional green, and it's considered shishi. So if you go out to a fancy restaurant, you might run into sorrel. So those are the leafy greens that are high. The other greens, many of them come from the cabbage family, like arugula. That's very low in oxalate. And then there's watercress. That's also low in oxalate. So there are leafy greens like cabbage. Anything from the cabbage family is low. And of course, the cabbage family is more than leafy greens. You also have things like turnips. Turnip greens are low too. So there's quite a few vegetables that aren't super high. And then there's potatoes. Potatoes and sweet potatoes are very high. I was a big sweet potato fan because I was on a gluten-free diet. I was eating them all the time. That was a big mistake. I love Swiss chard. That was a mistake too. Also, blackberries, clementine, tangelos, starfruit, kiwi, they're high in oxalate. Black beans and the beans we use to make Boston baked beans are high in oxalate. The pseudo grains like amaranth, quinoa, buckwheat, and teff, these are high in oxalate. Potato chips, obviously, and things derived from potatoes, chocolate, tea, black and green tea, the traditional teas are pretty high in oxalate.
And yet all that you listed would normally be something considered to be on a really healthy diet. But yes, obviously now not, and I won't say this is bad for everyone. People vary in their oxalate sensitivity. Yeah,
and it's more of a tolerance and a sensitivity because it's not really an allergy. But there's definitely lots of variables in our physiology that we don't fully understand. There's the biggest variable of all is how well our gut is working. So if the gut is really in excellent shape, but if you eat a lot of oxalates all the time or a lot of lectins and plant compounds, you may lose that excellent digestion. That's what happened to me. But depending on how much you're digesting and absorbing, how much moves from the food into your bloodstream, that's a big issue.
So does that depend on, let's say, your own physiology, and people would vary? Because I'm sure, I eat that stuff all the time, but my diet, I have to say, is really balanced. I'm not a vegetarian. I eat, first of all, very little because just food's not a big deal to me. And I mostly a lot of steamed vegetables, many of which you mentioned that might have oxalates in them, and then also some meat and not much else. But I'm sure there's variations just like with all food allergies in terms of particular sensitivities. But like someone like yourself and many people who are trying to be really healthy are way overloading on that oxalate side. And I find so many people who have chosen, because they're hearing plant-based, are eating so much greens. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner, they're having green juice with a lot of the vegetables you mentioned, and on and on throughout the day. And they, like you, are wondering why they feel worse on this new, very, very plant-based diet.
You're precisely right that there is a tolerance level we have, which is generally considered to be about 50 milligrams of oxalate in a meal, up to maybe 150 per day. But when we start overloading on these foods that are getting so promoted, and nuts too. I'm not sure if I mentioned that almonds are particularly bad, and then peanuts are high in oxalate too. It's very easy to overload on these foods. And that's what's happening. We're way overdoing our tolerance. Even if you have healthy digestion, it's taking in 9 or 10 times your tolerance level will eventually get to you. Unfortunately, this can be a silent disease. Like almost every condition can be occurring without a lot of symptoms. And that's the problem, is that you don't really realize you've got a problem because we don't know about the connection. But also the symptoms can be pretty subtle for a long time until they start breaking through.
Yes, that's true. Now, what are some of those symptoms that listeners might go, well, I have a lot of that stuff. It doesn't mean they're only on that raw food vegan kind of diet either, that they might get a sensitivity.
You can get into trouble on a junk food diet too, even though a lot of these foods are superfoods and it's people who are really making a concerted effort to eat healthy could be accidentally harming themselves, which is so tragic that you put so much effort and money and thought into your diet and it works against you. But you could also be like Pringles, potato chips, and chocolate candy person. Those are all major sources of oxalate, the French fries, potatoes, and the chocolate. So you could be doing a junk food diet and also harming yourself with oxalates as well. And the symptoms that eventually develop often include some kind of digestive problem. Could be leaky gut, could be indigestion, it could be constipation and diarrhea. And then there's connective tissue problems like arthritis, aches and pains, fibromyalgia, stiffness, extra loose joints in either direction. You can have funny symptoms with your joints and muscles. You can have neurological issues like my sleep disorder, mood changes, anxiety, pain syndromes, all kinds of stuff affecting nerves, even occasional bouts of really clumsiness where you're dropping stuff or bumping into things. That's a loss of eye-hand coordination, changes in vision, things like floaters and so on. Chemical sensitivity. You see, when we eat major things like spinach smoothies, it comes from the digestive tract over the course of about the whole process of food moving through the digestive tract takes 24 hours. But after about 5 hours post-meal is when you're going to see a peak of oxalate in the blood and in the urine. It eventually moves into the urine and we pee out oxalate. But before it gets there, it moves from the intestines into the liver, because everything we empty from the intestines goes straight for the liver. So the liver gets high exposure to oxalate, and then it just moves 2 inches up to get to the heart. And then the heart pumps it into lungs, and the lungs pump it back into the heart again. So the lungs aren't pumping, but that's the movement of the oxalate in our food hits these critical organs, the liver, heart, and lungs. And it's running through the vascular system, which is lined by this endothelial cells, which are constantly being exposed during these post-meal periods to higher levels of oxalate, which can cause chronic vascular inflammation. You can end up with Raynaud syndrome. You can end up with chemical sensitivity because you're wearing out your glutathione in your liver. People end up with arrhythmias, even lung issues. So it's pretty much any tissue, and it's very idiosyncratic. How it affects a certain person is going to be fairly unique to them.
So I think it's sort of an underutilized piece of information for those people who are suffering from so many of the issues. Because, of course, the first thing they're being told is stop all bread, which, by the way, I don't think is a bad idea, because many people have wheat sensitivities that cause a lot of these inflammatory responses. But they are not being told about also looking at the oxalate level and their particular sensitivity. Now, are there any tests that can confirm if there are excessive oxalate in someone's system?
You can confirm it, but you can't deny it. In other words, we can get a positive, but we can't get a negative test because the main routes of excretion is the urine and also the skin and so on, but primarily through the urine. And testing urine is a very imperfect science. A lot of people don't know how to do it, but there's these circadian patterns and the comings and goings of oxalate where the body is sort of, I think, pulsing the release of oxalate from the body in order to give the kidneys a break so that's not constantly excessively high. And of course, the dietary patterns will affect this. So you can take a urine test and get a low reading where it doesn't look elevated in oxalate. That doesn't mean you don't have an oxalate problem. It might mean you have a kidney problem where your kidneys are not removing oxalate quickly enough from the blood, and that's a big problem to have. So sometimes a low oxalate in the urine is giving you a false sense, well, oxalates aren't my problem, when in fact it could very well be.
So it's a good thing to consider.
You definitely should request a urine oxalate test. The problem is it is not a standard thing to do, and it's hard to convince your doctor that you need a urine oxalate test.
But also, like you're saying, Sally, even if you do get a urine oxalate test, that even if it does not show positive, it's not particularly an accurate test because it might be during the wrong time of day. If you were going to get an oxalate test and you want to see if your body is in fact, having high levels after eating those kind of foods, would it be good to load up on those foods before your test?
Probably. And usually they do a 24-hour collection.
Like you do with an adrenal hormone.
Yeah. And so, again, you could be spiking oxalate. And even if you're excessively high in oxalate, you can come within the normal range. It's really funny how those of us who are really getting in trouble with oxalate tend to have these little surges that get wiped out in the 24-hour collection. If your doctor is willing to just do a spot test in the office and say, go pee in a cup, it's good to do it 4 or 5 hours after you've had a meal that's had sweet potatoes or peanuts or some high oxalate food in it.
Because it might clear out by then?
Yeah, that 4 or 5 hour point after the meal is when the more of it is in the bloodstream and therefore getting into the urine.
So it sounds like the testing thing is complicated because most doctors have no idea what you're talking about. They never even heard the word oxalate. They don't know how to do an oxalate test. Sometimes there are, with many of these kinds of tests, especially more holistic people know how to order it. And there are places that will do it without a doctor's recommendation. You can just decide to do it, but it's not going to be covered. And it's very possible that it wouldn't be covered anyway, since, it's not set up in the lab as a regularly scheduled test. Like I'm sure Medicare would not cover it.
Yeah, I haven't really looked at the insurance coverage on it, but, an easy thing to do is just evaluate your diet. If you are prone to eating lots of seeds and nuts and spinach, you could be in trouble. And if you've got health issues, oxalate would be the first thing to suspect because of all the toxins in our diet. It's the one we're most heavily consuming and overlooking.
And that's big. That's your message, that people are not even considering it. So one thing to do would be look at a list of high oxalate foods, see, wow, that looks like my diet, and then see if you have a lot of those symptoms and start to put 2 and 2 together. And just like with food sensitivities, which I'm sure you know as a nutritionist, there are some very good food allergy tests, such as an IgG food allergy test, which, by the way, is not even accessible in New York State. People have to get doctors who will order it outside of New York State. But it does help you sort of put together an elimination diet once you see which things you have a high IgG. But I often tell people, forget that. Just do your own test and see how it works. So would you suggest that someone just tries that gold standard elimination?
Yes, you need to do it in an informed way, though, because if you go from a very high oxalate diet to suddenly a no oxalate diet or very low oxalate diet, the one of the problems with oxalate is it accumulates in your tissues. It bioaccumulates in your joints, in your bones, your bone marrow, your organs. Something like 85% of us have oxalate crystals in our thyroid gland by the time we're 50 years old. 85% of us, that's just a sign that modern diets are way too high in oxalate. And so when you quit eating it, that finally gives the body a chance to clean out the gunk, which is really a 10-year process. But the first couple of years of getting rid of oxalate means high levels of oxalate getting pushed back into the bloodstream, back into the kidneys, and it's very stressful. You can actually create kidney stones by over-releasing oxalate too aggressively. So we try to have people move more gradually away from a high oxalate diet. I talk to people, I say, this is like walking backwards out of a sleeping baby's bedroom. You don't want to wake the oxalate baby. So you want to move back gently and slowly from a high oxalate diet.
And so how would you recommend they do that? First of all, you'd have to look at a list of those things that you go, wow, I am having a lot of oxalate and I am having these symptoms. Like I would say for me, I have plenty of those foods in my diet, but I have, thank God, zero symptoms, nothing like that.
Okay.
That would be an alarm value. So I certainly wouldn't even bother going through that process. So you'd have to be motivated to really look into, wow, this might be causing my discomfort. Never thought about it. In fact, it has gotten a lot worse since I've become a raw food green vegan. Or vegan, however people say it, which often is the case.
It is often the case. We can't admit it to ourselves. It's the interesting thing, though, is oxalate is depleting the body of electrolytes and calcium. So you end up with osteopenia and osteoporosis over the years. Eventually, you end up with arthritis. Eventually, you end up with connective tissue disorders like those. And so even if you don't have symptoms now, it would be a good precaution to get away from foods that are ridiculously high in oxalate, like Swiss chard, spinach, and sweet potatoes and almonds. And so anybody with a kind of prevention mindset would want to curtail their use of these foods pretty seriously. And you would just look at your diet and say, like, I've been living on Swiss chard twice a week and sweet potatoes every day. I love sweet potatoes. I wouldn't want to give them up, but I'm certainly willing to give up my Swiss chard. So, start with things that you can live without, that you're just making yourself eat because you thought you needed to. You don't. This is freedom.
Well, with that, Sally, we are going to end our show today. Thank you so much for being our guest. We've been talking to Sally K. Norton, and you can find her at her website, sallyknorton.com. Remember, we always have a link from our archive so you can easily visit all of our guests. And I want to thank you, listeners, for tuning in to Herbally Yours, once again produced in the studios of 90.3 WHPC, Nassau Community College, Garden City, New York. For further information, email us at whpc@ncc.edu. This is your host, Ellen Kamai at naturalnurse.com, inviting you to join us next week for another edition of Herbally Yours. Until then, stay healthy.